This is Dr. Miller. Welcome to our studies in the Gospels. In this class, we'll look at the life and teachings of Jesus, the historical context in which he lived, and the ways his life and the Gospels have affected the history of the world. I've spent 25 years as a pastor and a professor, and I've talked to groups of people and individuals every week of all of those years about Jesus. In addition to that, the story of the Gospels have deeply impacted and shaped my own life. My deepest hope for this course is that the gospel message and the life of Jesus would impact and shape your life as well. If you need any help during this course, please reach out to me. Welcome to the Gospels. Well, hello class, it's Dr. Miller. Today we're going to continue in our series of studies in the Gospels. And in today's class, I want to look at all four of the Gospels in turn: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and perhaps spend 25% of the class on each of the four Gospels. I want to talk about the similarities and the differences between them and what we might gain from considering the four various perspectives. When we come at the four Gospels, the first question that people generally ask is, who were these four people? Where did this come from? It's become popular in the modern day for scholars to pride themselves in a kind of recklessly speculative skepticism. And you'll often find scholars today who will try to say, we have no idea who wrote the Gospels. They're anonymous. We don't know where they came from. When in fact, all the credible historical witnesses attribute them to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. According to the Gospel stories, Matthew and John were disciples of Jesus. Mark was a partner of Peter who traveled around preaching the gospel. You can read about Mark, also known as John Mark, in the book of Acts. And Luke identifies himself as someone who set out to investigate the story of the life of Jesus and capture it for anyone who wanted to know. So Matthew and John would have been disciples of Jesus. Mark would have been a second-person witness to the works of the apostles. And Luke, who's also referenced in the book of Acts, is also the author of the book of Acts, sometimes refers to himself individually and sometimes writes from the third-person perspective, from the first-person plural perspective, and refers to we as he writes the book of Acts. So probably had someone alongside him helping to write that book. But generally, the skeptical view that we don't know where these books came from requires a kind of wild speculation that isn't applied to other ancient historical sources like Aristotle or Homer. But because people realize the dramatic implications of the story of the New Testament, many scholars hope that the story of the New Testament is false because they are already committed to a kind of skepticism that's fundamentally atheistic and materialistic, and they don't like the moral implications of the story of Jesus. Now, if we ask when might these four Gospels have been written, we know they were all in circulation in the first century. There's a letter from Clement of Rome that dates to either the last decade of the first century or the first decade of the second century, and he references the Gospels as well as some of the letters of Paul. Clearly, the Gospels were in circulation by the end of the first century, within 60 years of the death of Jesus. Many people believe that Mark was written first, and the way they determine that is because they look at the similarities between Mark and Matthew and the similarities between Mark and Luke. Generally, when Matthew disagrees with Luke, he still agrees with Mark. And where Luke disagrees with Matthew, he still agrees with Mark. And that's led many scholars to believe that both Matthew and Luke had a copy of Mark from which they were copying, from which they were borrowing. When there are lengthy passages which are similar, it's far more likely that they had a common copy of Mark's gospel than that they were all remembering long passages of text from a simple oral tradition. Some scholars have also speculated that there was a copy of Jesus' teachings that were circulating. It's sometimes called the Q source, not to be confused with QAnon nonsense. The Q source comes from the German word Quell, which means source. And this is simply a theory that some of Jesus' teachings had been written down and that written copy of his teachings was in circulation, and that the gospel writers had a copy of that Q source from which they took some of Jesus' teachings as they reported what he said. Generally, it's suspected that Mark was written before the fall of Jerusalem, which happened in 70 AD. And scholars theorize that Matthew and Luke were then written after the fall of Jerusalem, although the dating of these narratives is again highly speculative. The theories upon which those dates are based are in no way airtight. Scholars sometimes like to overemphasize their or overextend their own suspicions and then assert it as historical fact. We don't know when in the first century those were written. We only know once we have references from other extra biblical writers to the Gospels that the Gospels were in circulation. Most people believe that John outlived the other disciples, all of whom were probably martyred, and that John wrote his books late in the first century. Most likely he was done before the turn of the first century and didn't live past the turn of the first century. But many people believe that the Gospel of John was written late, maybe 90 AD, and that the book of Revelation was written sometime after that. Again, just speculation, but that's the best that scholars have been able to put together. Now, when we talk about the similarities and differences between the four Gospels, the first thing we have to talk about is literary style. Clearly, these were not written by one single individual. They come in different voices. The first three Gospels are known to be very similar to one another and have come to be referred to as the Synoptic Gospel. Synoptic is a fancy word, which simply means looks the same. Syn is a prefix which means same, and optic has to do with optics or visuals. It means they look the same. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke have very similar material between them. You'll notice that each of them record certain stories that the other ones do not. Although Matthew and Luke tend to get a lot of their material apparently from Mark. There's one miracle that runs through all four of the Gospels, and that is the parable of the feeding of the 5,000, where Jesus breaks bread and spreads it among the crowds and feeds 5,000 people with just a few loaves and fishes. Now, why that miracle makes it into all four is, again, anyone's guess. I think it's probably a reference to two things. One, God was identified as the one who led the people out of Egypt and through the wilderness to the promised land. And as they wandered through the wilderness, some 1,200 or 1,500 years before Jesus, Moses leading them, there was a time where they were hungry and bread fell from the sky. It was called manna. And forever after, they referred to the manna from heaven, the bread that was provided for them. And so Jesus providing bread for the masses is a way of identifying him with the God who leads his people through the wilderness and provides for them. The second reference that I think the multiplying of the 5,000 might have registered in the people's minds was the fact that Caesar would provide bread for the crowds. Often when they gathered in their auditoriums and their Colosseums, the guards would sometimes provide bread for the people. And this was Caesar's way of controlling the masses. He kept the people in control with bread and circuses, it was said. And so when Jesus provides bread for the masses, the people see this and say, we've seen this before. We know who does this kind of thing. Caesar does this. And we don't want Rome to rule over us anymore. We want our own king. So perhaps Jesus is the king that was to come. And now we want to make him king. It says in John chapter 6, after he fed the crowds, they tried to make him king by force. So those two historical reference points, I think, might have made that miracle particularly important to all four gospel writers. And that might be why that's the one miracle that appears in all four gospels. So anyway, you have the Synoptic Gospels, and then you have John, written later, and written in a very different style than the other three. In the Gospel of John, Jesus' teachings are long and sermonic. And some scholars have speculated that perhaps John wrote his gospel using materials from sermons he had preached about Jesus. That John had captured the life of Jesus and taught it to people for some time, and now went to write it down using the sermons he had already scripted. And so John reads very differently than the first three Gospels, though clearly telling the same story from a different perspective. When you get down into the weeds and look at the particular differences between the Gospels, each one has its own preferred emphases. Mark is terse and to the point. It's very oriented towards action. He's very interested in the things that Jesus did and the places that he went. And in the course of Mark's gospel, Jesus seems to be always on the move. Mark leaves out the infancy narratives. There's no story of Jesus' birth. The Christmas story is not in there. And he leaves out the story of the resurrection appearances. He sort of ends on this mysterious note of they went to the tomb and Jesus wasn't there. It's a dramatic, suspenseful story filled with action. Matthew and Luke are much more detailed. They have longer narratives. Matthew's gospel consists of 5 blocks of teachings from Jesus. And some people think that Matthew did that on purpose because he's addressing a Jewish audience. And they look back to the 5 books of Moses, the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And they think, well, Matthew had Jesus give 5 big blocks of teachings to show that he is the new law. The new voice of God. Again, pretty highly speculative. I don't buy that at all. I don't think literary arts were so developed that Matthew was thinking in that way. If you go back and consider the nature of literature in the first century world, there wasn't a lot around. Most people were illiterate. There were not libraries being kept everywhere. Writing had been used primarily for pragmatic purposes. It was used for ledgers, for business transactions, and it was used so that kings could summarize their works and brag about themselves. There were little instances of literature being used as entertainment, like Homer telling stories of great wars. Virgil would be an early writer who would create plays and entertain the people in writing. Some of literature was used for educational purposes. Plato used it to teach philosophy, and Seneca would use it to teach morals. But again, the punchline there is it's meant to be practical. It's meant to pass on information that was needed. You really don't get into fundamental histories for a while, with the exception of Thucydides. Eusebius would write an early church history, but it's clearly done from a perspective of advocacy. There was no sense of capturing objective history. Everybody was trying to capture the perspective they most wanted to preserve. And so the gospel writers were not trying to write objective histories. They wanted people to believe in Jesus. And in telling the stories of Jesus, they're trying to tell the stories in compelling ways. That doesn't mean it's fabricated or exaggerated. That simply means they have a bias, and it's clear what it is. They believed in Jesus, and they thought everyone else should as well. So Matthew, writing to a Jewish audience, might have been trying to connect with them by using their own scriptures, but I doubt his literary structure was so developed that he intentionally included 5 blocks of teachings from Jesus to rival the 5 books of Moses. That seems far-fetched to me. Luke, also long in his storytelling, seems to show a preference for the poor and the underclassed. Luke has the great parables of the lost. In Luke chapter 15, the parable of the lost son, the prodigal son, and the parable of the lost sheep. And so Luke seems to have an eye out for those who are underprivileged, those who are lost and who need to be found. And so Luke's sense of storytelling is probably the most articulate of the four Gospels. John seems to have in mind a Greek audience because he begins on a very philosophical note. It's very different than the others. Matthew and Luke start with the Christmas story. Mark starts with Jesus' baptism and his ministry. But John starts with a sort of a philosophical foundation. John begins, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made, and without him nothing has been made that was made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all humankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." It's a very beautiful, poetic introduction that references Genesis chapter 1 and the creation of the world. In the beginning, God spoke, God's word came about, and there was light. Here, the word was God, and that word was light of all humankind. There's also a reference in John's introduction to a term that would have been common among Greek philosophers and readers of Greek philosophy. And that word is logos. When John says, "In the beginning was the Word," the Greek word for word is logos. Logos should ring a bell for you. It's the root of our word logic. But it's not just logic. It's not just reasoning. And honestly, translating it word isn't really accurate either. It'd be more accurate to say, "In the beginning was the foundation. In the beginning was the source of all sense and order and reason." And that order, that foundation of order, has stepped into the world, has been incarnated into the world, and that's who Jesus is. John clearly seems to be talking to philosophers who are committed to the idea that there's a foundational order to things. There's a source for the order of all the universe, of all being. But that source came as a person. It's a sentient being. It thinks for itself. It's not just a philosophical idea. It's a real thing. It's a God who became human. And so John has in mind a Greek audience, it seems. So those are the four Gospels. Now, when you look at the four Gospels, you'll notice there are many similarities between them. They tell very similar stories. But at certain points, you'll notice there are differences between them. Minor differences in detail. When Jesus teaches his disciples what we call the Lord's Prayer, it's recorded differently in two different Gospels. Or when you look at the story of the resurrection, in one Gospel it says that there was one angel at the tomb on Easter morning, and another Gospel says there were two angels at the tomb on Easter morning. People who are what we would call fundamentalistic in their belief, who tend to be conservative and afraid of change and not really given to nuance, look at those differences and try to rationalize them and explain why they weren't there in the original documents. They'll say that somewhere there was a copying error, and somehow that's why one gospel says there was one angel and another gospel says there were two angels. This is a stupid kind of scholarship. It's not scholarship at all. It's a commitment to a blind theology that makes them unable to see what's right in front of their eyes. There's no reason why we have to believe that there were originally manuscripts which had no errors or differences between them, just as when we have multiple witnesses attesting that there was a car accident, but there are slight differences in their story. It just makes it all the more clear that there really was a car accident. And the differences in their story we can ascribe to the frailties of human witness. But it doesn't defeat the claims that there was actually a car accident. In fact, the discrepancies in their stories make it all the more clear that no one went through and made it up or edited it. If all the Gospels matched up in every detail, I would be even more suspicious that some editor had fixed the problems. But because we look at Matthew and Luke and see a difference in the number of angels at the tomb, I'm all the more confident that they really are telling the story as they knew it, and that no one has gone through and cleaned it up and fixed it. So when you come to differences in the text, don't panic or attempt to correct it and come up with some kind of theory as to why it was correct in the original documents. And don't pounce on it and try to say, aha, they're all fake. These have the mark of authenticity. This is how multiple witness attestations of an event would actually read. So there are minor differences in them, but they don't account for any major theological discrepancies. In fact, in the entire Bible, if you go back and look at copying errors that have happened throughout history, or differences between ancient copies of the text where there'll be a letter that's different in one ancient manuscript that is different from another ancient manuscript, those differences account for less than 2% of the Bible, and they don't create any theological problems for the story of the scriptures. So those who go back and find discrepancies between multiple witnesses and either used it to try to cast doubt on the Bible or who try to rationalize them away, I think are just off on a wrong path. This is how any collection of multiple sources would read. So that's a brief introduction to the differences between the four Gospels, differences and similarities between the four Gospels. Now let's get into them and let's look at each of the four Gospels individually. The distinctive of the Gospel of Matthew is his audience. It's generally suspected that Matthew was writing to a Jewish audience. I said earlier that some people believe that because there are 5 blocks of teachings of Jesus, which they believe are an answer to the 5 books of the Torah. I don't think that's the case. But it is clear that Matthew is at pains to show that Jesus is the fulfillment of Jewish expectations. You can see that right at the beginning of the Gospel, in the opening of the book. Matthew begins with a long genealogy, which traces Jesus' line back through the history of some of the great fathers of Israel, and back to King David. The Jewish people had always expected that a Messiah would come, a Savior, a deliverer would come, and that person had to be in the bloodline of David. So it's important that Matthew traces Jesus back to David. It also shows that Jesus is part of a long line that goes through the Hebrew Scriptures, that his family line was critical to the story of the life of Israel, back through David on to Abraham. Matthew also goes out of his way to talk about how Jesus fulfills the expectations named by the prophets. Over and over again, Matthew quotes the prophets and says, this is to fulfill what was written in Isaiah, what was written in Micah or Malachi. And Matthew goes through and cites various Hebrew expectations named in the prophets of who the Messiah was to be. So for instance, in the birth narratives, Jesus is born of a virgin. And Matthew says this is to fulfill what was written by Isaiah in chapter 7, verse 14. Or his family then escapes to Egypt to evade the persecution of King Herod, and Matthew tells us this was to fulfill what was written in Hosea. Finally, he fulfills his ministry in Galilee, and this was to fulfill what was written in Isaiah chapter 9. Matthew does this at least a dozen times, and cites the Hebrew Scriptures repeatedly with the anticipation that his audience respects the Hebrew Scriptures and knows them. That shows that Matthew is writing with the anticipation that his readers are Jewish. When you get to Matthew's first great sermon of Jesus, and one of the longest blocks of Jesus' teachings, you're in Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7. And this is referred to as the Sermon on the Mount. It's a collection of Jesus' teachings that most people suspect he did not teach all in one sitting, but rather that Matthew collected them and put them all in one block. And they are primarily Jesus' interpretation of the Old Testament law. And in that sermon, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says over and over again, you have heard that it was said, but now I say to you. You have heard that it was said, do not murder. But now I tell you, do not even hold anger in your hearts. You have heard that it was said, do not commit adultery. And here he's quoting the 10 Commandments. Don't murder, don't commit adultery. But I tell you, don't even look at someone lustfully. And Jesus does this repeatedly with teachings from the Hebrew Scriptures, which he seems to make more strict by applying them not to behavior, but to the mental life that lies behind the behavior. Not only are you not to act out in anger, you are not to think in anger, right? And so Jesus is taking the Hebrew law and he's making it more radical. There are two ways to take this, and I think they're both a little bit true. One of them would be the Pauline reading of the law, and that's to say Jesus is making the law so intense that no one can fulfill it. It shows us that we are unable to fulfill the expectations of the law on our own efforts. And that means we will need to be saved through a process of atonement. And that sets us up for the crucifixion of Jesus. Paul would say the law condemns us because we can't fulfill it. And if you read the Sermon on the Mount and you try to fulfill the teachings of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, you'll walk away going, that's too much for me. And that's one way to read the Sermon on the Mount, with the understanding that Jesus was trying to tell us the law is more intense than you can handle. But I believe it's also an expectation for the discipleship of people who would follow him. He wanted people surrendering their lives wholly to God and living faithfully, and not just following the letter of the law in behavior, but being transformed internally into people who are wholly committed to loving and following God. Again, it looks like Matthew has done this specifically to address the Jewish critics of the day. Now, in doing this, in talking about how Jesus fulfills Jewish expectations for a Messiah, what Jesus is trying to do is, what Matthew is trying to do is say, Jesus is the anticipation of what Israel was to become. Jesus himself sets this up. He calls 12 disciples. He has this inner circle of 12 guys who are his disciples. And that parallels the 12 tribes of Israel, which constituted the nation of Israel. It's a symbolic way for Jesus to say, I am constituting the nation of Israel in my teachings and my followers. It is no longer the geographic borders set down for Joseph and his brothers. It is now those who follow me and obey my teachings that constitute the true Israel. And Matthew seems to want to be saying to the Jewish audience, you're no longer going to be defined by your bloodline and inheritance. You're now going to be defined by how you respond to Jesus' teachings. If you believe in him and obey him and follow him, you are the new Israel. And this will set us up for the radical move in the early church, that the kingdom of Israel is now open to the Gentiles as well, not just to Jewish people, that non-Jewish people can be welcomed in through their obedience to Jesus. Matthew might be at pains to address a Jewish audience in this way and show the connection of Jesus to the Hebrew scriptures and the Hebrew line, and to show that Jesus fulfills the Hebrew prophets. Because the first great opponents of the Christian movement were the Jewish people. The Apostle Paul was originally a persecutor of Christians. He went around killing Christians and made the first Christian martyr out of Stephen, having Stephen stoned to death for preaching about Jesus. And the Jewish people began an internal persecution of the Christian sect because they believed it was a heresy. They believed it was a body of false teachings erupting within Judaism, which was going to pollute pure Judaism. And so the rejection of, or even a persecution and murder of Christians, was a fulfillment of the Hebrew expectation that impurity was to be put out of the camp. That the nation of Israel would only be protected by God if they put impurity out of the camp. And so driving Christians out of existence would have been in keeping with the anticipation of the Pharisaic culture of the first century. And so Matthew may be writing apologetically to defend the Christian faith, saying, hey, Jewish people, you shouldn't be persecuting Christians. We are the fulfillment of what Judaism has wanted all along. Jesus was the prophesied Messiah, and instead of persecuting this, we should see this as a fulfillment of what we ourselves believe. And that is the key theme and focus of the Gospel of Matthew. That's his audience. That's who he wants to communicate with. So that's how, if you're reading the Bible left to right, that's how you're first introduced to Jesus, through the lens of somebody who wants you to see he is the fulfillment of everything that has come before him. Now we're going to look at the Gospel of Mark. Mark was largely ignored by the early church. At least he didn't receive an official commentary written about him until the 6th century. The other ones attracted far more attention because Matthew and Luke are just better writers. Their literary style is better and their stories are more detailed. Mark's Gospel is rushed, and there are some parts of it which would have been difficult for the early church to use well. Mark is obsessed with the mystery of Jesus. Often Jesus works miracles and then tells people, now don't tell anyone that I just did that. Mark seems to have the gospel enshrouded in the big question of who is this guy? This guy is so mysterious. He was mysterious to everyone around him. In fact, the only the only things that accurately seem to recognize him are demons who call him out and name him. But the people on the whole end up wondering about the life of Jesus. There are two punctuations in the story of Mark where somebody clears it up. One is the pivotal point right in the middle of Mark in chapter 8, where Jesus asks his disciples, who do people say that I am? And they reply, some people say that you're John the Baptist, some people say that you're Elijah, and he says, but who do you think I am? And Peter says, you are the Messiah. And that's Mark's punchline right in the middle. This is who this is. Every bit of his life was shrouded in mystery, but Peter got it right. In Matthew chapter 8, Jesus is the Messiah. And then at the end of the gospel, when Jesus is crucified, Mark reports that a centurion said, surely this one was the Son of God. And that's sort of a final concluding punctuation mark that says, Peter got it right earlier. That's who this was. But in general, Mark captures this sense that people weren't sure who Jesus was. Mark shows over and over again that Jesus acted with authority. Jesus cast out demons with authority. Jesus taught with authority. He says over and over again, he uses the word authority. It's one of Mark's favorite words. But that doesn't, while that is clear that Mark is an insider and knows where Jesus' authority comes from, Mark wants us to see that in his lifetime, people wondered at Jesus. Mark's gospel is divided into two sections, and the pivot is Mark chapter 8, where Peter identifies him. The first half of the gospel is about the identity of Jesus, and the second half of the gospel is about the mission of Jesus. The identity of Jesus, again, is shrouded in wonder, but it leads up clearly to Peter's confession of Jesus. If I were ever thrown up on a stage and told, grab a Bible, preach a sermon, the place I would probably go is the Gospel of Mark chapter 1. Because Mark chapter 1 summarizes the whole of the life of Jesus in one chapter. In Mark chapter 1, you see Jesus doing specific things that would then define how he did all the rest of his ministry. There's an introductory passage about his baptism from John the Baptist, and then you have Jesus calling disciples, come follow me and I'll make you fishers of men. He heals the sick. He says, let's go and teach. That's what I've come for. And he teaches, repent for the kingdom of heaven is near. And he casts out demons. He says, I am willing, be clean. He heals lepers. And then he says, be silent, come out of him. He exorcises people. And so the ministry of Jesus is laid out in its entirety in the Gospel of Mark chapter 1. And Mark wants to show us by the actions of Jesus who Jesus is. Mark will tell us over and over again he had authority. So clearly Mark has figured out who he is, and he wants us to figure it out too. So he walks us through the first 8 chapters, building up to the confession of Peter, at which we're given the clear message, this is who Jesus is. Then from Mark chapter 8 to Mark chapter 16, he tells us about the mission of Jesus. And what's ironic about the mission of Jesus, especially in the hands of Mark, is that as the Messiah, the Redeemer, Savior of Israel, he has this ironic role of suffering and dying. He's the servant of Israel, not the conquering king. And that's different than what Israel had hoped for and expected. They wanted a king, a general, in the bloodline of King David, who, like King David, would slay the Goliaths of the land and become king on the throne and cast out the other kingdoms and make Israel rich. And Jesus instead took on the role of a servant, washing his disciples' feet, living in humility, walking among the poor. And in the end, he rides into Jerusalem on a donkey, fulfilling the prophecy of Zechariah 9, and showing that he himself was actually a humble king and not a conquering king. Some people believe that this is why the people turned on Jesus in the last week of his life, because he went into Jerusalem for their Passover, which was their Independence Day. And they wanted him to throw off King Herod. And instead, he disturbed the temple because he cared about purifying the worship of Israel. And so many people think that the reason they turned on him in the last week is because he did not bring about the conquest that they had wanted. Jesus goes into Jerusalem and is crucified and dies. And then Mark's gospel ends on sort of a mysterious note. The women go to the tomb and they don't find Jesus. Now, clearly, Mark believes Jesus is risen from the dead, because Mark reports that several times Jesus said he would rise from the dead. Jesus tells his disciples that multiple times in the Gospel of Mark. And Mark obviously thinks Jesus is a reliable guy, so there's no question that Mark takes Jesus at his word. But why does he leave in this mysterious ending? Well, that's how he began. He sees the whole story of Jesus as a mystery that is to be unwrapped. And he means to leave us on sort of a mystical ending where we're left to wonder, what does that mean? Although clearly the proclamation of the church at that time was that Jesus had risen from the dead, and clearly Mark believed that because he said that Jesus predicted it several times. So this is the nature of the Gospel of Mark. It's a gospel filled with action and activity, mystery surrounding the identity of Jesus that's ultimately revealed by Peter and by a centurion at the end. And then we see in Jesus' message the emphasis on service and on sacrifice and not on conquest. And that's who Jesus is through the eyes of Mark. Now let's look at the Gospel of Luke. Luke is different than Matthew in that Matthew seems to address a Jewish audience. Luke actually seems to want to address a Gentile audience, or at least defend the entry of the Gentiles into the body of the Christians. Both Matthew and Luke are well-written literary works, different than Mark in that they're longer, more expansive, and more detailed in their descriptions of the events and stories of Jesus. Luke, however, sets out in the opening of his gospel to say that he himself is compiling a history of Jesus based on what he's learned from other people. Unlike Matthew, he was not one of the original 12 disciples, not a first-person witness of these events, but instead somebody who probably traveled with Paul and celebrated Paul's life. Initially, Luke and Acts were probably all one work that have been broken in half now, so that the gospel can be grouped with the other three gospels, and the book of Acts, also written by Luke, can follow that, telling the story of the early church and what happened to the disciples after Jesus ascended into heaven. Luke, if you picture it all as one work, Luke Acts as one work, his gospel moves in sort of an hourglass fashion. It moves from the early description of the birth narrative of Jesus right down into Jerusalem, into the last week of his life, and then it explodes outwards again to the whole world. So you have a movement towards Jerusalem and away from Jerusalem in the book of Acts. To understand what Luke is doing there, you have to look at Acts chapter 1, verses 8 and 9. After Jesus has died and risen from the dead, the disciples go to him and say, "Is now the time that you're going to restore the kingdom to Israel? Do we get our king now? Are you going to be a king and sit on the throne and restore our nation?" And Jesus replies, "That's not for you to know. You won't know the times that God will reconstitute the nation of Israel. But you are to be my witnesses in Jerusalem," which is your immediate circles, your friends, in Samaria, which is the people you don't like, in Judea, in Samaria, the people you don't like, and to the ends of the earth. Now we're going to go and reach the Gentiles. And the book of Acts shows that the gospel leaves the Jewish population and becomes a message for the whole world. So Luke has this broader sense that the gospel is a universal message for all the world. It's not that Matthew doesn't believe that, but Matthew is clearly focused on interpreting Jesus as a fulfillment of Jewish expectations, perhaps because the Jews are persecuting the Christians. Luke, rather, wants to say this message is now more expansive than what we've lived in before. This is a message that, beginning with Paul, is going to go to all the nations. Luke's emphasis, again, tends to be those who are downtrodden and outcast. He has a special interest in the poor, in the sick, in women, in people who were marginalized by society. And again, Luke chapter 15 is one of the most powerful capturings of the themes of Luke. You get the story of the prodigal son. The story goes that father had two sons, a very obedient older son and a rebellious younger son. And the younger son goes to his father and says, "Give me my half of the inheritance." In other words, I don't care if you're dead, I'm just going to take your money and leave. He goes and takes the money, moves to the big city, and spends the money on prostitutes and wild living. When he is absolutely poor and destitute, he goes back to his father just to beg for a job, not expecting to be welcomed back as a son. But the father sees him coming from a distance, runs out and hugs him, puts new clothes on him, gives him the family ring, which they would have used as a credit card, and lets him back into the home and throws a party for him. The message is that even when we have rebelled against God and rejected God, we are welcomed back by a God who loves us. That no matter how destructive our lives have been, God is for us and wants us to return. That's what Luke sees in Jesus, the one who loves us even when we're lost. Jesus will call himself the Good Shepherd. In the Gospel of John, we'll see Jesus pick up the shepherd imagery. But if you look at Luke chapter 15 at the beginning, Luke has a profound parable of Jesus, which captures who Jesus is. And it's an image that the early church picked up. Jesus compares himself to a shepherd who, if he has 100 sheep and 99 of them are safe, but one of them is lost, a good shepherd leaves the 99 who are safe and goes looking for the one lost sheep. That's who Jesus is. Jesus is not interested in creating a circle of already religious people who just want to be comfortable with each other. Jesus is on a mission to save lost sheep. And he fully intends to create out of us apprentice shepherds who are also in pursuit of lost sheep. If we are followers of Jesus, our calling is not to create a circle of wagons where we can be safe at church with other religious people who think the same as us. Instead, we are to be people loving a lost world in Jesus' name and pursuing those whose lives have gotten broken. Jesus in Luke is the good shepherd who goes looking for lost sheep. Jesus will use that language for himself in the Gospel of John, chapter 14, I am the good shepherd. The early church picked up on that image. The early church was not drawn to the image of the cross the way Christians are today. You'll see Christians wearing crosses around their necks. The early church didn't do that because the cross was a horrible symbol of torture of the Roman Empire. There were people still being crucified back then. Instead, they picked up on the image of a shepherd carrying a sheep on his shoulders, bringing the lost sheep home. In fact, in the oldest building of Christian worship that archaeologists have discovered, a home called Dura Europos, which dates from about 250 AD, there's various mosaics around the inside of this house. They know it was used for worship because there's a baptismal pool where people were baptized in the house. But above the door is an image made out of tiles, an image of a shepherd carrying a sheep on his shoulders. More recently, in a shipwreck off the coast of Israel that was just excavated, they found an ancient Roman ring that had the image of the shepherd carrying a sheep embedded in the ring. This was a powerful and meaningful image for the first century church, which was attracting people who were poor and lost and sick and broken, people who were then persecuted by the Jewish people and then persecuted by the Gentiles, by the Roman Empire. By the time John is writing his Gospels, Emperor Diocletian is persecuting the Christians, continuing the persecution that Nero began in 65 AD. So the Christians suffered an internal persecution from fellow Jewish people and an external persecution from the Roman Empire. They cherished the idea of a God who was a shepherd looking for lost sheep to carry to safety. And Luke loves that image. Luke captures that image and dwells on it. Sometimes people ask me if I wanted to read a book of the Bible, where should I begin? I always say read one of the Gospels first. Read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That's the place to begin. But if they say which one, I often leave it to their own discretion. But if I know it's a person who's hurting, who needs to be cared for, I like to point to the Gospel of Luke. Luke has a beautiful way of telling stories that's very engaging to people who may not have known the God who loves them. So that's a brief introduction to Luke. Finally, let's look at the Gospel of John. I already told you a little bit about the introduction to the Gospel of John. John's literary style is very different, and he's clearly addressing a different audience than the other Gospels. He seems to be writing to those who are familiar with Greek philosophy, as he refers to the Logos in the opening chapter of the book. However, what's interesting about John is that the body of teachings of Jesus are very different than you see in the other Gospels. They are long and sermonic, and they're more concerned with eternal life than the other Gospels seem to be. One of the distinctives of the teachings of Jesus in the Gospel of John is that there are sayings in which Jesus says, I am. Depending on who you ask, there's different numbering of these, but there are 7 I am statements, according to some counts. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the gate for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way and the truth and the life. I am the true vine. Scholars generally believe that because John is drawing from some Hebrew imagery, right? He begins with the creation of the world. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was the light. That John, in using the I am statements, is referencing an event in which God revealed himself to Moses through a burning bush. Moses was walking and came across a bush that was on fire but wasn't consumed by it. And God speaks out of the bush and says, you're going to go and set my people free from Pharaoh. You're going to go to Egypt and tell the Pharaoh, let my people go. And Moses says, but what if they ask me who sent me? What am I supposed to say? And God replies, I am. And it's sort of God's way of saying, there's nothing by which to define me. I am the source of all things. I am the Logos, the Greeks would say. There is no other thing to reference. I am that I am. And so when Jesus repeatedly uses the term I am, many biblical scholars believe that's Jesus identifying himself with God, which was part of the blasphemous charges for which he would be handed over to be crucified in the end. But by some counts, there are 7 of those I am statements, which is interesting because there are also 7 miracles recorded of Jesus in the Gospel of John. We know from the other Gospels that he worked many more miracles than that. And John himself even says there's a lot more things that Jesus did that aren't written here. But John names 7 miracles that Jesus worked. The turning of water into wine, the healing of a royal official's son, the healing of a disabled man, the feeding of the 5,000, walking on water, healing a man born blind, and raising Lazarus from the dead. Now, there's a good chance that the numbering of 7 is actually intentional. The number 7 is important to the Hebrew people because there were 7 days of creation, which led to the 7 days of the week. And the Sabbath day, the 7th day, became a defining day in Jewish culture. They were to remember and keep the Sabbath. So the fact that there are 7 signs and 7 I am statements are probably not incidental. That is probably John being very intentional because of the power of his literary prose and his thoughtful presentation of the gospel. It's most likely that John was educated and fairly sophisticated in the way he put his book together. John generally seems to be focused on the eternal nature of Jesus' revelation, and especially if you read the body of teachings in John 14 and 15, the Last Supper of Jesus, and the teachings that are contained there, he's got a sense for the self-revelation of an eternal being through incarnation that he believed many others, including some of the disciples themselves, simply missed. John seems angry at Judas, who betrayed Jesus. He's angry at the Pharisees who argued with and persecuted Jesus. He's still bitter at Peter and makes fun of Peter, capturing Peter's failure to walk on water, the fact that he got to the tomb faster than Peter. John seems not to be afraid to tell on his peers because he seems to think he understood the message and revelation of Jesus more deeply than others. In fact, at the end of his gospel, he even reveals that he has been referencing the disciple whom Jesus loved, which he says is him. The one who writes the gospel is the disciple whom Jesus loved. So he believes that he had a special and deeper connection with Jesus than the other disciples, and even portrays himself sitting at the Last Supper and sitting next to Jesus as though he were closer to Jesus than the others. Mark would go on to John would go on to write 5 letters altogether that are captured in the New Testament. There are 3 shorter letters, which we name 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, all of a very similar literary style that use some of the same imagery that you see in the Gospel of Jesus. And John's writings are drawn to cosmic themes of lightness and dark, of love and hate. Everything is strong, big polar opposites. And then you have the book of Revelation at the end, which is an apocalyptic vision which portrays the fall of the Roman Empire, which would happen centuries later. But John, I believe, in his anger at those who persecuted and crucified Jesus and then would persecute the church, John captures in Revelation a final justice that comes to Rome, in which Rome is leveled as a consequence of their rejection of God when he walked among them. So John's themes are big and philosophical and cosmic and tied to the eternal end of things. His gospel begins with the creation of the world. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and it ends in the book of Revelation in the end of the world in heaven where everything is made right again. John's a powerful gospel. Again, for most lay readers, I'd start with Luke first, but John has a take that's different and perhaps a bit more inclined to mysticism than the other Gospels, and certainly reads very differently, which is why the others are called the Synoptic Gospels, and John is left out of that circle. But that's a brief introduction to the Gospel of John. Hello class, this is Dr. Miller. Welcome to our studies in the Gospels. In this class we'll look at the life and teachings of Jesus, the historical context in which he lived, and the ways his life and the Gospels have affected the history of the world. I've spent 25 years as a pastor and a professor, and I've talked to groups of people and individuals every week of all of those years about Jesus. In addition to that, the story of the Gospels have deeply impacted and shaped my own life. My deepest hope for this course is that the gospel message and the life of Jesus would impact and shape your life as well. If you need any help during this course, please reach out to me. Welcome to the Gospels.